Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. Hi, I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Oh, hey there. Oh, hey, it's Jackie.
And it's me, Diana. Hello.
Hi. Well, everyone, welcome to this podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we pick a topic and discuss related articles, giving evidence or credence to whatever claims might be made in the field. And, usually we have a topic picked, but, I hadn't picked one this week. We usually do it as a group or we kind of each pick one. I didn't have any ready. So I was like, I'm just going to kind of thumb through whatever articles are lying around. And I found these articles that seemed really interesting, but there was something about the authors of the articles that struck me as familiar. So can I tell you what articles that I had?
Oh, you want to do the articles?
Yeah, can I do the articles this time?
Yeah, sure.
I thought these might be fun to talk about, but I wasn't sure. And I wasn't sure if we could get the authors. So there are these two articles about like tracker training, so like BCBA supervision tracker training.
Yeah.
Right? Very complicated. You need it to make sure you're doing all your hours, requirements to sit for your exam. And I just kind of found these random. I just typed into Google and said, any articles, whatever. And I found these two by these folks. There's a Diana Perry Cruz.
I think it's pronounced Cruise.
Cruise. There's a Diana Perry Cruz. Is it spelled with an E or an A? I don't know. A Jacqueline MacDonald.
No, Jacqueline.
Jacqueline MacDonald. And I thought we should invite those two. What do you guys think?
Sounds boring.
Okay. Well, unfortunately,
no, just kidding. It sounds fascinating.
Sounds fascinating. I was going to say it's the only articles I prepped for today, so that's what we're doing. But there's a third author on these, and I thought let's even get all three of them, right? So I reached out, to Diana, I reached out to Jacqueline, and I reached out to Jacqueline, and I reached out to the third author, the primary author on one of the two articles I found, Ryan Atkinson, and he was gracious enough to come. So I think I have all the authors here. Let's see if I do. I go 1, 2, 3. They're all here. Hello, authors.
Hi.
Hello.
And especially hello to Ryan.
Hi. Thank you guys for having me. This is delightful.
Oh, good. Well, we're awesome. So glad you're here. Yes, for those of you who like, maybe this is the first time you've listened and you're confused because we said the same name like 5 times, I'm joking. These are articles written by Ryan and Diana and Jackie on tracker training. And I knew they wrote them. It wasn't the surprise. I'd heard about him. I saw the
you really
pre-draft.
Had going there for
I know.
A minute.
That's why acting is very important to be able to do. So in case my bit was too confusing, this week we're talking about tracker training. And these are two articles written by the crew here. I'm going to say two of the 3, but it's 3 of the 4.
Yes.
3 of the 4. I did not write anything. I had nothing to do with this. I think I heard an idea and I said, that sounds like a great idea. Go for it. Awesome. I don't even know if I did that much work. Probably not.
I don't know. We don't talk about work.
No.
Right.
We talk about podcast. We talk about behavior analysis. We don't talk about
behavior analytic research.
Our actual jobs.
Tell me what the titles are.
I will. There's 2 articles here. We've got Teaching Graduate Students to Identify and Adhere to Practicum Requirements by Perry Cruz, Atkinson, and McDonald from Behavior Analysis and Practice 2021. And Training Graduate Students to Enter Fieldwork Data Using Asynchronous Online Instruction by Atkinson, Perry Cruz, and McDonald, also from Behavior Analysis in Practice, but it is from 2022, the recent years of 2022.
Super recent.
So before we start talking about tracker training and what that entails, Ryan, why don't you, because you're not usually one of the hosts of the show, why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Okay, thank you. Well, again, thank you guys for having me. This is amazing. Yes, my name is Ryan Atkinson. I'm a doctoral candidate at Simmons University under Judah Axe.
I love Judah.
We know him.
You guys, actually, when I was trying to scout for advisors, I read a couple of his papers and I listened to your episode with him on problem solving.
Episode 31.
Yeah, that was a long time ago.
Okay. Yeah, and then public school, BCBA, and then before all of that good stuff, I was a master's student at Regis College.
Go Regis!
Oh my gosh.
I know.
Wow.
I saw you guys there a couple of times.
And you used to TA at Regis College too.
I did, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And
best TA in radical behaviorism I ever had. Just put it out there.
I think maybe the only of one. Okay, yeah, just checking.
But also the best.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that's it.
That's it. Okay, good. Well, now we're going to be talking about tracker training. I was going to start by doing the intro, but it makes no sense because I was like, well, should Dan or Jackie do the intro part? But then you got to talk about the article, but I'm just going to let you all go. So tracker training, why? What is this? Maybe folks have had their BCBA kind of like me. I only know it through being a supervisor. They didn't make us log our hours quite like this back in the day.
Do you work? Oh my gosh, yay! You win.
Check yes for I think I got enough hours. I think was the standard at the time.
Yes, no, or maybe. That's all you had to indicate.
As long as you got maybe, they let you sit. It was great. But they only gave the test once every, fortnight when there was a blue moon and you had to, go to a special cave. It was a lot harder then to just find the test. So tracker training. Tell us about tracker training, folks. What is it? Why do we have to do it? Why is it such a pain?
Sure. So if you want to take a step back and talk about the fieldwork requirements that are currently in place for BACB students, right, who are going to go on to sit for the exam, then the current requirements are that students get either 1,500 or 2,000 hours of fieldwork time. And it isn't quite as simple as just like keeping a notebook for yourself and like writing down what hours you get. And then, like you said, Rob, telling the BACB, oh yeah, I totally got them. Yeah, no problem. They're here. Because it's not just, did you work for 1,500 hours? It's a lot more complicated than that. And there are ways in which the 1,500 or the 2,000 hours are delineated. And every hour that you accrue is delineated into 2 bins. So that time is either going to be listed as restricted, meaning most of the time that you've been working directly with a client, or unrestricted, meaning most of the time it's a type of activities they're going to benefit you in your long-term desire to become a BCBA by being more clinically oriented. So it's going to be one of those 2, restricted, unrestricted. And then also each hour that you accrue is going to be binned as either independent or as supervised. And supervised means that you're there with your BCBA supervisor, either being observed and or getting feedback and or talking about something that's client related or task list related. But because it's like that complicated system and you have each hour being binned in multiple ways, it's just not that easy to keep track of what that time is going to look like. But it's really important that you do, because there are requirements across the length of the fieldwork about how much of each of those types of time you need to have accrued. So underneath the 1,500 hour model, you need to have 10% of that total time be supervised. Underneath the 2,000 hour model, you need to have 5% of that time be supervised. And under both models, you need to have at least 60% of your total time fall into the unrestricted category. And of your supervised time, at least 50% of that needs to have been independent supervised rather than, individual supervised rather than group supervised time, as well as a few other requirements that we don't need to throw in there. So it is a little bit complicated, right? And you do want to make sure that you've hit all of those marks all along the way in the event that when you go to submit all of your materials for the BACB exam, you are audited and the BACB asks to see all of that backlog of information about how your hours were actually accrued.
But as long as you're not audited, you can make up the whole thing and no one will ever know, is what I'm hearing.
No.
Wait, what?
No, you took a big jump there. Nope. Even if you're not audited, you still need to make sure that all of your hours are correct. Every last one.
Okay. So it's not something that I could do at the end, right? Like in the parking lot before I go take my exam or before I mail off my application, right? I have to have this done way ahead of time.
You can submit things electronically now.
Oh, I can?
Yeah. But no, you should be doing it all along the way.
All right. So Ryan, as the individual here who's had the most recent actual experience of filling out the tracker itself.
That's true. Yeah.
Can you? I mean, you're the master of it now because you've done research articles on it. It's been a big part of your coursework and your schooling work. But what was it like the first time you had to do the tracker, fill out the tracker? You felt like this is easy. I've got to publish research on how easy this is. What were you thinking?
The very first time I did it as a grad student.
As a grad student.
It was terrifying. And by the way, at this point, you do it right when you walk in the door, right? Like you start. For us, I think we started our third semester.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so for a lot of people, it's their first time in a graduate program, and then they're probably working full time, and then all of a sudden they're transitioning in now immediately. And that was terrifying. I had to ask 2 friends from the program who were a year ahead of me to both like walk me through it again, even though you all did a very wonderful job doing that yourselves. It's just very anxiety provoking.
What were some of the errors that you made or some of the difficulties that you thought specifically?
I made the same errors that it seemed like everybody continued to make, which were these really specific. So like I would typically think of a restricted hour as like, that's BT work. It was originally what I thought. And then unrestricted was BCBA work. And that's entirely right. It's maybe a fine guiding principle, but then things fall through the cracks when that's your guideline. So like, I think one of the main ones was creating stimuli for preference assessment or for any assessment was counting that as unrestricted where you wouldn't count that in reality as anything. But it's like fair enough if you think, you're running assessments as a BCBA. I feel like creating things for the exam. Yeah, fair enough. And so creating stimuli, logging things that you shouldn't. So like time at a conference, I remember was one of them. Yeah, I think it was counting things I wasn't allowed to count. And then having Diana tell me to take them off. Yeah.
That's good. I mean, even as someone who never filled out the tracker but has to look at people's trackers, I did appreciate getting to read some of the common errors because, for me, I never filled out the tracker. And I watched the videos and I see, but it's like the one more thing, and you have multiple supervisees who are potentially at multiple universities, and they all have their trackers, and some of them are better than others at filling the trackers out. And you sort of just want to be like, it's all great, whatever, I'm sure it's fine. And it's technically the student's responsibility, but like so many things in supervision, if you say it's just the student's responsibility, you're setting yourself up for a big problem when there's a mistake, and then it's your responsibility as the supervisor. So it is something that, as much as I know I'd like to say, well, this is a boring topic I never need to know anything about, if you want to supervise, you also need to know what's supposed to be going on in those trackers and how to catch and correct errors.
And just to maybe clarify too, when we were talking about tracker and the purpose of these studies, we're talking about the BACB fieldwork tracker, which at the time of the studies was required by the BACB.
It was not required. They said it was not required, but in the case of an audit, it was required.
Right.
So basically it was required.
Right. And then since then, it's no longer required or supported at all by the BACB, but you do still need to have all of your hours accounted for with the same level of specificity that you did in the BACB fieldwork tracker. So people now may be using different systems, but they all still need to be breaking all the hours down in the way that I just described.
So now it's even worse in that it's one more thing that multiple supervisees from multiple organizations may have multiple ways of tracking. But the rules of what they should and how they should track things should be the same.
Yes.
The format may be different.
Yes.
And I can't imagine they'd be that different. I would hope they would not be that different, but who knows? It is a very strange process. It's a lot of work.
Yeah. So, but in this conversation, when we say tracker, we mean the fieldwork tracker, because that was what was in place at the time.
So, not to jump too far ahead, but going into the future, are you still training your students like you need to be logging these hours? Here's how to log them. Here's the way you want to make sure that you're not counting things that shouldn't count. Like that part hasn't changed. It's just there's not an official BACB branded tracker anymore. It's the only change.
Correct.
Okay. You can use a Regis branded tracker now, if you wanted to, I guess.
I can.
Yeah, you can.
But the bigger takeaway here, I think, is that we were able to use some, technologically sound principles of behavior analysis to teach people how to do this, which is really applicable across the board, whether it's the BACB fieldwork tracker or something else.
All right. So the principles are going to be the same. It's more just some of the content. That scaffold looks good. Well, I guess for Dinah, since you first were writing on this, I'm not sure, Ryan, when you came into the process, but was it you were just like, I'm so tired of this, there's got to be a better way, and then when you made it, you're like, I might as well publish all this stuff because it was a lot of work? Or what was that process like?
Yeah, I think so. Do you know when you were involved in this?
I do. You were starting to realize, I think maybe I should just publish on this stuff because you're doing it anyway.
Oh, okay.
And I think you guys were working on your gamification paper.
Yeah, it was before. You came in right when we were finishing up the gamification paper and starting the tracker training paper.
Yes. And then I left and then just continued to do stuff with you. But that's when
Okay, great. So the way that started was, I have been the fieldwork coordinator at Regis, what used to be called the practicum coordinator, for a long time. And initially I was looking with Jackie at research on how to help people accrue more hours, which is where we got the gamification paper from. But in doing so, I began to realize that because of the changes that had occurred in the way that the fieldwork requirements were for the BACB, a lot of students were having a harder time just understanding overall what their accrued hours needed to look like. And the tracker is really complicated. And I was seeing a lot of errors just in putting hours into the tracker. So let alone trying to get more hours, but like, we need to take a step back and just make sure that the hours that we're getting are accurate first and foremost. So that was kind of where this original training had started from. And so then you joined in, Ryan, after I'd done the data collection for that?
Yes. Yeah, I think so.
And helped on the write-up of that paper. So the first version of that study we had structured as behavioral skills training, mostly. So it was during the pandemic, but it was done synchronously via Zoom. So I would model for students how it looked like to fill out the tracker. I had little scenarios for them to practice with at home. And then I would give them feedback on each of those. And we would kind of meet like that week to week until students met a certain level of criterion. And then they were free to be, quote unquote, trained and leave the tracker training. And that worked okay. But it also was hard to get people together to do it via that synchronous type of model. And so then in the second study, that's where we switched it over so that more of it was operating asynchronously via what we use, which is Moodle, is our learning, what's that called? LMS? What does that stand for?
Learning management software.
Oh, yes. Okay. Great. Thank you. Yeah. Do you want to talk more about that?
About the learning management software?
No. About the
Tracker 1. At this point, I just call them Tracker 1 and Tracker 2.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I think the move to asynchronous made sense. I'm trying to think of some of the tougher parts of the move to full asynchronous. I don't know if I'm jumping the gun, but because they were moving at their own pace. Before we were able to, we were having those 2 to 8 people per group, and we would do modeling, role play, rehearsal, feedback, and it ran at our pace. And then with the asynchronous, it ran at their pace, which is a benefit. But I just remember peaks and valleys of grading.
Right.
Because you had initially 5 or 6 go-getters coming in and submitting everything. And then a period of all of August where it's just a big lull. And then the semester starts, and I know you guys are getting on people's backs, and then it is another peak of 20 people. So yeah, benefits to each.
When you were developing, whether it was the synchronous or the asynchronous, were there sort of just general principles other than BST you were looking to focus on? Had you done a review of trackers over the past 5 years and the 10 most common errors or anything like that? Or was it more just, we're going to get some good examples, we're going to just set up, kind of vignettes or just sort of practice together? Kind of how did each component of this get developed over time? Or was it just, we're going to sit down and talk over these common errors?
No, I think the first one was kind of just scattershot because we just wrote the stories, or you wrote the stories, and then we didn't address what the common errors were. At that point, we didn't know. Maybe we could have looked up most common errors, but
I don't know where that info would have been.
A blog or something like that. Yeah, I don't know.
There's really nothing. I actually did look, and there was
of most common errors. Yeah,
you would have had to probably just look at your own students,
right,
and that would have been your sample. And
right. At that point, we couldn't correct for each scenario being equally difficult. Because we don't know what's the hardest piece. And so we didn't know, people didn't know a ton about behavioral gerontology. And that was a key word that messed us up.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
That's right.
So during the second one, we were able to kind of systematically parse through each one separately. So, yeah.
So that's the first one. It was just kind of, let's go through the tracker.
Yeah, well, we did an error analysis on after the gamification paper, because part of that study too is me looking at all of their trackers every week and seeing what they didn't have correct. They needed to have all the pieces right in that study in order to get like points for their class, earn points for their class. So through that, we were able to see some of the errors that people were making in their trackers, but there were just a lot of them, basically, across the board. So that was marginally helpful. But like Ryan was saying, initially we just tried a lot of different stories and didn't necessarily maybe move them from being easier to harder as people progress within the BST program. And because we had students broken up into different groups, it was always possible that some students could have gotten, or some participants could have gotten a question that was a little bit trickier than a different group. And we didn't really make a plan to control for that. So in the next round, we tried to structure it more where it was a progression through these different potential areas that we saw as challenging for students, so that initially they were just experiencing what it was like to fill out the tracker itself. And then we sort of hopefully, well, it was systematic and hopefully it was like least to most progression, right? Taught them a little bit more about the tracker. So first it was just, this is how you fill out the tracker. This is like a common scenario that you might use to fill out the tracker. These are things that people often make mistakes on in terms of not listing time that they could list, right? Like you were saying, like missing out on unrestricted time. These are common mistakes people make by listing time that they shouldn't have listed, the opposite, right? And then we worked with them on the percentage piece. So only having your restricted time be 40%, et cetera. And that piece was really, really hard for people, but we saved that toward the end. And that was kind of like a icing on the cake piece of the study rather than something that we based the criteria for mastery on.
So when you were doing your scenarios, it was originally not meant to be anything too least to most. It was more let's just go through stories. Mm-hmm. I don't think we've really talked about exactly what the components are. We should probably do a quick second. If folks have listened to the show more than once, they know we talked about BST and they probably know the steps by heart by now. But just in case, let's talk a little bit about BST as a training setup, and then how it was implemented in your studies. So just really quickly, BST, behavior skills training, is a process in which there is focus on kind of the modeling and the feedback are kind of the key components. You're going to give someone a skill, talk about a skill, you give them, show them what it looks like, give them a list of the steps, and then have them perform the skill, and they receive both corrective feedback as well as praise for steps correct, and repeat until the skill is learned. How did you see that going in terms of a tracker training? Because I could see it being done with someone's individual tracker, but that wasn't the means that you were trying to use. You were trying to use these vignettes so that folks could sort of have these, everyone would have the same sort of set of data that they were pulling from.
Right. Well, the challenge in not using a standardized story is I don't necessarily know what people have done for all of their different time. So it would be hard for me to know how accurate that was. At least here I had a baseline of the scenario, so I could make a comparison to that and determine if people had gotten all the pieces that I wanted them to. But that remains a limitation of this, is you don't really know if everyone's capturing everything that they're doing in their day-to-day. So there's a generalization sort of gap here that we don't really have any knowledge on. So I'll tell you about what BST looked like for study 1. And BST, like you said, is instructions, modeling, role play, and feedback. So in each of these synchronous Zoom sessions that we did, I would provide them the instructions and the modeling by walking through an example scenario with like my version of the tracker up on the share screen for them. And they watched me literally put data in line by line based on the scenario. So the scenario would be like, Danielle works at like Shooting Stars, and Danielle met with her supervisor, Mary, from 9 to 10 a.m. Then Danielle worked with a client from 10 to 11 a.m. Then Danielle did a functional analysis from 11 to 12 a.m. It would be like that. And so we would just walk through and say, this is, restricted, this is unrestricted, this is supervised, this is independent, and show them how that's going to print itself out in the tracker when you put the data in. Then I would send them home meaning the Zoom session ended, and I emailed them.
They were home at the time.
In this version, it was via email. emailed them a sample scenario that wasn't Danielle, it was somebody else, and they practiced at home. Then they sent it back to me. I graded it, and then they came to the next week's session together. When they came back, I hadn't given them their feedback yet, but rather they met up with other participants and reviewed it together, and then I popped into the breakout rooms to give them feedback. So that's where the feedback piece came in, but they also were able to check it against one another. So that worked okay, right? But it also was quite time consuming. If a student missed, then they were off track, and then we would end up having to run like an individual session with them. So I had like multiple students in multiple sections of this class going at different points in time, and it was a lot to manage. And so we had been looking, I think in the context of some other research too, right, folks, about how we might use programmed instruction to teach skills to groups when we could have most of that instruction operate asynchronously. So that's what we wanted to try with tracker training too.
Okay.
And the one thing that I think we missed is that for this specific subject group, the motivation was high. Right, so it wasn't a motivation issue because they were actively accruing their hours. So they weren't participants that were like, "Oh, I'm just going to learn tracker training." Right? They're just not like undergraduates that don't have they're not vested. Like they were very vested. They were actively in their fieldwork classes. Right? They were taking data monthly. They were, like getting the wrath of Diana's feedback if they didn't do it correctly.
I'm very nice.
I know you are. You're too nice. I'm just kidding. You are though. And so I think that's important to highlight is that they were students that were actively in master's programs. Because,
great point.
Right, because sometimes when we need to do research, we're like, we're going to try it out. And we just find randos in like a subject pool, right?
Everyone signs up for the tracker training. Oh,
Wow.
let me join
in.
in.
Right, so people do that. If you're like, we're going to recruit someone and do a pilot study.
Sure.
But here I think you have to take that into consideration that these were current master's students that were actively in a class, right? Receiving a grade, doing fieldwork toward the BACB exam. So there was some vested interest.
Yeah.
in
And they
doing
could choose to be in the study or not.
Right.
But
we
they
didn't
all
say
receive
that
the
either.
training.
And the one other thing that we missed is that during the training, you explain the rationale for the tracker training. Part of BST, right? So we have the instructions and the rationale because that's a very important piece that
I'm sure I did.
you'd know I was there and you didn't. Right. So because when we train BST, if we just give instructions without the rationale, people are less likely to do it. So just want to put that out there.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
Hey everybody, sorry to interrupt, but I thought you might want to know that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved. By listening to our show, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening, then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to enter in 2 secret code words on our Get CEU page, or click the link in your podcast player's description for this episode. You're going to need to enter 2 secret code words, like I said, though. I'm going to give you the first one now. These are special guest secret code words from Ryan, and the first is cabbage, CABBAGE. It's a leafy green vegetable, great in a coleslaw, perhaps. Cabbage. All right, back to our discussion.
So we've got our scenarios, you've got the multiple Zoom windows, folks, could check their answers with their partners, and then you'd give them the feedback, the final feedback at the end. But I think we're kind of going to do like each section of the study development, between both articles, and then we kind of come in with the results at the end, because they are very similar in terms of the goals of the research, and it was time consuming. So how many sessions before you were wishing that you looked at this asynchronously to start, or was it a matter of you didn't even think about it because you just had so much time, you didn't have time to think, you were just running so many little sessions?
We were just running a lot of sessions, and it was good in some ways because then people could ask me questions in real time, right? And that was important. And you too, you ran them too. But I'm always trying to figure out how I can be most efficient. And it probably wasn't the most efficient method.
So going to the asynchronous model, Ryan, which you were heading that up, what were the big kind of differences in planning? And then if you could talk about the planning, because I love hearing how people take, face-to-face or Zoom-to-Zoom synchronous lessons and turn them into something that can be done, at their leisure.
Right. I think in that case, it became all front-loading all of the work, all of the real work. You would grade, in the middle of it. And you did a fair amount of that and making sure, and then I would run through as a student and try to make sure that the thing was living on its own and its own being for them to interact with. And then once it was going, they had exposure to the same pre-baseline, I think. They went through at the time, was it the 2018 BACB guidelines? That might have been the old one. Okay. And they did the pre and the post test and the PowerPoint, and that still served as the instruction. But then you move to baseline, they still have the 1 to 2 scenarios. Did we make new scenarios? I think we altered the old ones.
Yeah.
Or were they all new? Okay. I think we corrected for things like gerontology.
Yeah, I think we corrected some and then made some extra so we would have enough to counterbalance them.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, once it was up and running, they went through lessons 1 through 4, and we didn't have to do anything as they were moving, except they would complete lesson 1, and that would open up access to a new tracker and a new corresponding template and scenarios. They would submit it. We would grade it as quickly as we could. And then if they met the criterion, the next one would open up. They'd go through those 4 lessons. And then we had a quick midpoint probe, which was a repeated baseline. And then 2 more lessons. And in those 2 more, you mentioned we tried to add a little bit. It did not, they could progress even if they didn't hit this.
Right.
But it was balancing the tracker, which was because you have those sort of the math and the ratio requirements that are overlaid on top of. So, you work 40 restricted hours, you're probably only counting a fraction of that, and you have to do that math on your own. And so we were just curious. Again, them progressing wasn't contingent on them doing well there, but that went not as well as I think we would have liked.
Yeah.
Can I ask, because I know that someone's going to email us because this is what they always email, how long did that front loading take overall? Like if you were going to consequate all of the work that you did in hours, how much would that be? Because that is what someone's going to ask. Like just ballpark. Like 40, 60. It's like a lot of hours.
40?
Yeah. 40 sounds good. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because people always email. They're like, how long is this going to take?
Yeah, it's quite long.
It's not 2.
Yeah.
No,
it's not 2 hours, right? It's not a daytime activity.
Right. And the way that this training was structured is reliant on an operating system like Moodle, because you can make these lessons inside it, and probably other ones work too, but I don't know how you do it without this type of backbone for it.
You can, you can get a free Moodle account. You used to be able to get a free Moodle account and sort of play around with. I don't know if you could do something at a large scale, but
Yeah, so each of these, we're calling them lessons, but they're also called lessons in Moodle. So it would have video in there and then questions underneath that had to be answered correctly in order to finish the lesson. And then only once you finish the lesson could you then do the homework that we would then have to hand grade.
So basically the only difference between the 2 systems was one was either pre-recorded, everything was set, and you didn't need to step into the classroom. You just had to be in the online learning, or were there other differences between sort of the content of the lesson? The lessons were a little more kind of organized by different skills a little bit more.
Right. I think that was the main, in terms of the content, that was the main difference, is that the common errors that we saw in the first one were now interspersed, and we could identify which ones were particularly problematic. But we didn't have to do anything else beyond grade them as they came in, which was the problem with the sort of like peaks and valleys of the people coming in hot in the beginning. But yeah, I don't think there were any other differences in that sense.
No, we were just trying our best to make sure that we had accounted for some of those earlier limitations by having, two different groups of participants that were experiencing different scenarios, but that had been counterbalanced for each of these identified issues, and they were presented with a certain number of those, but they were different ones throughout. And then anyone who didn't pass the first round of that lesson would then get the second scenario as the backup. It's all demonstrated in Table 2 in your paper.
Thank you. Now, I have a couple questions that are a little bit more just like structure of research related, because certainly I hear this idea, and my first one is, well, you've kind of got a captive audience, and maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I wouldn't have thought much of that. We're like, well, they're grad students. They have to do what you tell them, and you're going to use your data for your research because that's part of the process. And someday they'll be professors who have grad students. They want to be able to just use their data willy-nilly. But that wasn't certainly the case, because you can't just make people be in your study, because otherwise you can't get approval for your research. What is that process like for students? I mean, is it harder to do informed consent when you sort of do have like literally a captive audience in terms of they kind of have to do your tracker training? They have to be a part of your study, even though you just maybe won't use their data. Is there any difference that goes into it, or it's exactly the same process?
It's pretty much the same in that the informed consent was part of the whole series, and I wrote it and said it multiple times that you don't have to participate in this, but you're going to do the training either way if you're going to need to do the, use the fieldwork tracker, but you can either consent or not consent to have your data included. There is absolutely you will not experience any difference in how this goes for you, and they didn't. So most students say yes. If you say no, and it's not a big deal, they don't want to do it.
Do they tell you why they say no? Or
We don't ask.
No, but I didn't know if any just said, oh, I'm sorry, I don't want to do this just because I'm really
They're
confidential.
But they're just giving me back the informed consent. So
all right, so some just check no, and
Yeah, we wouldn't ask.
No,
right?
but I mean, they're students. They might not know that they're not. I don't know. When I had a professor, if I didn't want to do something, I would have an excuse as to why I wouldn't want to do it. Maybe that's just me.
Well, in that moment, we wouldn't know, right? Because you're just handing back the informed consent form. So, or not hanging it back, and then they just never get it. So we don't follow up and be like, hey, didn't get your informed consent, right? It's just like, oh, we didn't get it, so you're not in it. Even if you wanted to be in it, you're not.
Yeah, you didn't do that.
Yeah.
Then the other piece would be, how does one go about turning something that you were like, well, I have to do this as part of, my work as a professor, then turning it into a research design? Like where does the thought of how it needs to be run to be research versus how it might be run if you're just like, I'm just going to do this for class, and at the end I'll, see if the students improved, I'll look at their grades and I'll ask them what they thought about it, and I'll change it for the next class. They're similar processes, but they're not exactly the same. So what went into the research design? Like what parts did you have to think ahead of so that you had a research design rather than just we're using data effectively?
I think staggering, we needed different, and I suppose in the first study we did have different cohorts and they were separated already. Is that right? Even if they weren't, we ended up separating. Were they?
No, we, from the beginning, because these students were like coming into practicum.
Right.
So we designed it so that we had 2 Moodle classes, and then they were randomly assigned to the 2.
And then staggered the baselines accordingly. Yeah.
Yeah, the biggest thing I think you have to remember is that you have to start it from the beginning. This isn't something that you can, like, halfway through data collection be like, this would be a great research. This is answering a great question. We're going to start right now in the middle of everything, right? Yeah. So this is something that has to be premeditated. So maybe you did something as like, and it worked, right? You're in clinical life, but then you do it again with research in mind, right? It can't be something that you're like halfway through and you're like, oh my gosh.
It's either research or it's not
or
research.
It's not, yeah.
Yeah, she had run, I'm not sure how many, she ran mine when I was in grad school. How many did she, cohorts must she have seen through, the both of you? A ton before all of a sudden begins to make minor tweaks. So you're like, okay, I want to stagger a baseline, but I don't want to withhold it for too long. Also, I don't want that cohort too far ahead of the other cohort. And so I think after having run that for a bit of time, you we're able to, Diana, we're able to map on the structure of, I suppose, gamification, but then the structure of the first paper onto, we're talking about how you mapped the design onto it.
From the beginning.
From the beginning, and not just like right in the middle. You're like, this would be a cool study if we
Right.
started right now.
We had done lots of
Practicum
iteration.
1 was
Yeah.
a further iteration on a previous version of the tracker training that I had attempted to do. So I guess I'm of the mind that if you're going to do it and it might be effective, then you might as well check experimentally to see if it really is, because then you can show to other people that it works. So that's why you'd bother to arrange it. It's not the easiest thing because you are having to sort of artificially extend those initial baselines in order to establish a multiple baseline across groups or classes design, which is probably what you said.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know, I feel this really acutely. I think when I'm working with grad students, like we should never want to waste our clients or our participants' time, right? But I also think because grad students are like a stressed out bunch to start with, I'm like, oh, I feel bad like making you do a couple extra of these baseline for me, but I also do want to be able to demonstrate that there is experimental control within this type of design.
And it wouldn't really work to say which groups of you are probably the procrastinators here. You're going to be in my long baseline because I just need you to like not do much well for a while like that. That would kind of be a big confound. So
Exactly.
you can't take your type A's and your laissez-faire students and group them too effectively. Well, for research purposes, you certainly.
Right.
I don't know what happened to your class if you did that. It might have problems.
Usually all works itself out, to be honest.
Okay.
Everybody's got their own style.
So, what were the changes in design from the first study? I mean, we talked about the changes in the procedural design, but in terms of experimental design, were there any big changes that you were mindful of in sort of crafting the two different experiments, or that you thought would make more sense because it was asynchronous versus synchronous?
We went to multiple baseline across participants for 2, which I think was better because it was more granular. Unless, of course... No, yeah, that was the design change. That was the major change. I don't think there was anything else, design-wise as opposed to content-wise.
I do not recall it this time.
Nor do I. I was just trying to be more confident in the asserting the exact same thing.
I wasn't there,
Yeah.
so there's no way I can check. Much like tracker training, I'm just going to sign off and say it was great. Good job, everybody. We did it. Let's hope we don't get audited. So you've got your designs, you've got your 2 studies. One thing we haven't really talked about is how well it worked. Did your students pass? Did some folks not do so hot with it and require some remedial work? Let's start with study 1. What were the big results from study 1?
I don't know that we need to break down the results of these 2 studies separately.
Okay. Well,
Because
generally
they're really quite similar. And I think because we based what we were teaching them on 2 very tried and true, like probably the 2 most tried and true methods, right? Behavior skills training and PSI. We got what we were overall looking for. And in study 1, if you look at those data, I guess I can talk about them more specifically, then there are some spots where there's variability. And a lot of that was related back to a couple common errors that people continued to make, such as, I want to say, I tried to trip them up about, you're getting supervised via phone for this one. And it's a trip up because you can't get supervised via phone, right? But sometimes people would still write it down.
You got it.
Is that still the case? I thought
Yes. Nope.
That's still the case, but when you were using the BACB fieldwork tracker, it was a
It
drop-down
was
option.
on the option.
Yeah.
So that's why it really messed people up so bad.
That's so bitchy.
It's just an oversight
I know,
that they've
but
never
right, they're like,
corrected.
we're gonna check you.
But you mean
Then I'll wreck you.
but
Yeah.
phone like I called you on my touch tone phone, not like over Zoom.
That's
correct?
different. Yeah.
Okay.
FaceTime
The
is
video
different.
is okay, but
I'm-
your voice.
I'm just trying to think, like, when's the last time I thought about just phone without video?
Right.
It seems a little...
Well, just thinking about supervision also doesn't count.
And
Telepathic discussions are no go.
Texting also doesn't.
Shared
count.
dreams
Yeah.
about supervision. Can we count those?
Emails either. No.
Okay.
No. So that tripped people up, right? And
What if I wrote a letter about the supervision I was hoping to do and they mailed it?
That would count.
Oh, that's
the one exception. Yes.
Okay, good.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Real fancy cursive. I got my calligraphy set out and talked. Okay.
So if you look at those data, they look kind of variable, and it's those types of things that are why. It didn't prevent us, I don't believe, from demonstrating that we taught this skill to the participants, but it was one of the, jumping off points for study 2 of how we needed to further teach some of these really specific errors in the hopes of catching them early and making a change in those pieces specifically, which is what happened in study 2.
Yeah, I think and it was fairly consistent in terms of what to the main pieces we were trying to teach. Then we touched on, I think there were 2 parts that were secondary, but not as successful, I suppose, which was balancing the tracker and all the monthly forms training.
Oh yeah,
at the end.
That's right.
That did happen at the end of the second study. We did a quick attempt to teach people to do their monthly forms because if you get audited, then you have to produce this stuff. But you always have to do your forms, no matter what, and those are complicated as well. And so we did our best to teach that as well. Still multiple baseline across participants.
Right, and it was just enhanced instructions was the only independent variable there.
Right. And a little less success. But the main piece that we were trying to get at, just identifying and adhering to practicum requirements, that worked out just fine.
And the forms, it was the BACB monthly verification form.
Yes,
and then
exactly.
specific.
The site-specific one.
Form. I feel like the sites, I don't know if I remember correctly, I feel like the site-specific form, enhanced instruction, worked well. Maybe it was the monthly
There was a
verification.
difference. I forget which one was worse.
No,
but
the
there
monthly
was
forms is easier.
The monthly forms was. Okay.
It doesn't have as many things that's being asked for.
So you've got 2 studies, overall very effective in terms of teaching graduate students to use the tracker appropriately, at least in terms of theoretically, they now should be able to do the tracker without any errors because they went through all these scenarios, added some other pieces that you could iterate on in the future. What were some other thoughts? Like if you were going to do a study 3, what was missing? What would you want to add?
I don't know at this point. Just addressing limitations, maybe?
I think trying to teach people about the percentage piece. Like they
That
know
was
what the
big.
percentages are, but that continues to be a really tricky thing for a lot of students who are kind of new to the whole system, is that you can only list as many hours as you have supervised time to equal 10% of, right? Which is like an algebra equation, what I just stated, right? And same is true if you record 10 hours, 6 of those need to be unrestricted time and only 4 can be restricted. And that's hard because I know people are working way more restricted hours than that, but you can't list them all or you won't have enough unrestricted time. So keeping track of that month to month and making sure all of those things are still in compliance is really tricky. And the type of training that would maybe need to be done for that may not be as easily done in the asynchronous model, but maybe that remains to be seen. So that, I don't know.
Ooh, maybe we could do a enhanced lesson, right? Where you pick, you do drop-ins or you pick matching, right? So you give them the math problems and then initially give them the answers to choose from, but then slowly fade out the answers that you choose from to a fill in the blank section. That might be, just thought of that right now. Because an enhanced lesson in Moodle allows you to do a lot of fun stuff.
And they do really need to learn the math piece.
Right.
Because you could just
It's just
say,
math.
we'll just make a more fancier Excel sheet. But that's not enough because you could accidentally balance it.
Right.
Like you could put in a stray
Yeah.
restricted hour. The Excel sheet at its best says all green, you're good to go.
Right.
In reality, your entire month is not great.
And that was
Yeah.
one of the things that would happen, right? Is
Right.
if one of the scenarios we had, if they listed one of the hours in the wrong way, like restricted or unrestricted instead of restricted, then they would think that they had the hours balanced correctly, but they didn't because of that type of error. So it's like a double error. It ended up being really complicated.
Yeah.
Yes, it did.
I mean, I'd like to think that you could do some sort of Excel macro where, it adds up your hours. And once you hit, you put in I worked this many hours this week. I got this much great. So Excel now knows if it sees numbers in this column that add up to more than 40% of that, it just reds out the rest of the column. So you can put as much as you want in there, but it's all going to be red, and that should signal you don't bother. You're maxed out. Don't put any more here. I'm trying to think if there would be an easy way to do that. And the answer is probably no, because if it were easy, it would pop into my head. It's like, oh, you just do this function. But you'd probably require some sort of macro or programming or something. But,
Yeah, but just teaching them. I mean, we could also do this training and include a section of math and make it really easy at first so that people aren't like, math, no! Because that's what I do when I see math. I get nervous and then slowly fade out the prompts.
That would be an idea for the future. But I think the other thing that might need to change is every couple of years, the fieldwork expectations change.
They do.
They said that it's not going to change for a while. The next change is 2027, but that's to coursework. So they've changed the coursework for 2027. So we have at least until 2027 before they're going to change any practicum stuff again, because they give us a long time before. So we're good till 2027 at least.
They're changing it so that there's an minute requirement per month for observation time rather than a number of observation.
That's good.
Yeah.
And when does that go into play again?
That same year, I believe.
I think it's 2027.
Okay, still a ways
It was
off.
2026, and then they bumped it back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes when they do the newsletters and I see the year, if it's a year that sounds like they'll be
Far
flying
away.
cars, I say, I don't need to pay attention to that right
same.
now.
Me too, actually. I'm like, whew, that's so far away.
That's future Rob's problem.
Yeah, so like my class this year is doing tracker training, but I'm not running it as a study. So I simplified some of this. I'm doing more sort of spot checks on their homework versus, giving them like this level of feedback. I didn't have them do an initial baseline or anything like that. And it's not a study, so there's no informed consent type of thing. So I'll see at the end if they still learned what they needed to learn via this process. And if not, then that will also give me more information for the future on whether it needs to be done with this level of care and attention.
Still using the asynchronous model, or did you move back to synchronous?
It is some of both, actually.
Oh, okay. What does that look like?
Hybrid.
I updated the lessons that we did for Tracker Training 2, so they got to listen to me at home, talk about it. I show them how to fill it out. They do a homework. They do the whole lesson in a homework, but then we come into class and I pair them up and they make comparisons of their tracker homework together, and I come around and help them.
Oh, okay.
So
not too dissimilar, too.
it's really the best of both worlds.
What was the feedback on doing this with students? I mean, did you get like nasty emails of like, this stupid thing doesn't work, or I hate doing this tracker training, or was everyone relatively happy?
I got a couple emails when I wasn't grading them fast enough.
Like,
So someone-
and how fast enough was not fast enough, Ryan?
It was
Because sometimes,
not a short amount of time.
come on, you got 5 seconds, buddy. Let's go.
It was, you'd get them on a Friday. And so like someone's, trying to get from lesson 2 to lesson 3. And that you need to grade that in order for them to open it up. And then you get an email Sunday morning. You're like, hey, just checking in, wondering why this wasn't graded. That was the only feedback. The social validity was great, but
Yeah.
So everyone felt pretty confident about their tracker training. Not the tracker training, sorry, the tracker usage going forward.
I think that's an important question is, does learning how to complete the tracker with a scenario map on to then, accuracy with your own hours and or confidence with your own hours? And for many people, it seemed like that transition was made well, but there are a few people that had continued to have a hard time in filling out their actual tracker, even though they had met mastery criteria for the training. So there's other factors there that are harder to account for, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, do you think it's a matter of just need more data in the machine? If you had enough crummy trackers, you could figure out all the error patterns and make 10 amazing lessons that just captures it all? Or does it start becoming, looking for a needle in a haystack? Why would I bother looking for every single little error? Because some of them are idiosyncratic. I mean, is there an end point to tracker training error patterns?
Well, you don't always make an error because you don't know what to do, right? There's a lot of other factors going into it. And when you're a graduate student, you have a lot of different requirements on your time, especially when you're a graduate student who's also working full-time too. So although I know everyone wants to do a good job on their tracker, it might not be their top priority. There are a lot of other things that they are probably thinking about, and they're motivated because they need to accrue their time, but there's just a lot of different stressors. So I don't know that further training is necessarily the piece there. It may be getting everything done is the bigger piece.
All right. Well, let's move into dissemination station. So normally this is the part in the show where we talk about, what's the take home from this research? I mean, I'll sum up a little bit of some things. I think I have a more interesting question for the two of you to answer. BST, really effective. And hey, asynchronous learning is pretty effective as well. And you should probably learn to use your tracker before just starting to, punch things into the Excel sheet. So that seems like a given. It might not be that exciting to talk about. What I think might be more interesting is kind of going through this process for a very specific problem that you are finding. Is there any sort of more general lesson you took in terms of your own teaching of other skills in the future? Or do you plan to use more asynchronous training? Was it too time intensive? Is there something about BST in teaching that you found could generalize to other skills? What were the big kind of personal lessons, I guess, you got from this line of research?
I had an interesting, because I started plugging into the first one as a mentee. So I wanted it to work for other reasons. Because I wanted to do better myself personally. And then now, a couple years later, not that long ago, now I'm mentoring for the first time, which is a whole new experience. And then for their practicum experience. And so they have a different tracker, which again, same content, different layout. And so now I've just been trying to map that onto my behavior as a supervisor. And that's been interesting, going from the mentee to the mentor in that period of time. Yeah.
Do you feel that going through this experience and sort of getting into the nitty-gritty of this one small piece of supervision has helped you with your thoughts on supervision or how you perform as a supervisor?
It has helped me immensely with the tracker component. I have a wild amount to learn in every other regard. Yeah, but with the tracker, I'm doing very well. Yeah, thank you.
Just like I think that's one of like the big adult laws of just because you've gotten really good at one thing doesn't mean you know anything about anything else.
That I still don't know about supervision. Yeah,
there's no one lesson that and now you can do everything really effectively. But that's good though. That's one less thing to worry about. You don't spend as much time on the tracker training part. See, that's the part I ignore as long as possible. Talk about people emailing me, hey, have you looked at my tracker? Oh, maybe next week I'll look at it. Sure. I want it away from me. I don't want to look at that darn thing. I'll observe you. We'll do feedback sessions all day, but I don't want to look at your tracker.
Unless it's my student's tracker, of course.
Oh, yeah. That was a lot easier.
But hilariously, I defer all fieldwork-related questions to Diana at all times. They're like, do you know the answer? I'm like, yes, but I'm not going to give you the answer. Please ask Diana.
I also defer any questions about people's fieldwork to Diana, even for people not in the Regis graduate program. I say, I know somebody. They know all about this stuff. I'll ask them and get back to you.
And you send me like cryptic texts.
Yep.
Which there's not enough information for me to answer.
I need the answer now.
I don't understand the type of time you're trying to ask me about.
Diana, how about you? Now you've been doing gamification. You've been doing BST tracker training. Has it changed you as a professor in any way or as a supervisor in any way? Or is it just affirming what you already knew?
For me, I think it's important that we apply our science of learning to these types of problems and situations. And I don't want to call it a problem like it's a problem, but it's like, this is my job. And these are things that are important for me to be able to help my students do well and for my students to feel successful at, because I know that fieldwork in particular produces a lot of anxiety for students. So I was excited to be able to think about I know how to teach things. How can I make this a better experience for them and something that's a little, hopefully less daunting. And you can use what we know about how to teach things to teach so many different things. It just happens to be that this is the thing that I spend a lot of my time doing, is thinking about the fieldwork requirements and playing around with how they look in Excel. But you could, if you're a professor, you could apply this in other ways. And, maybe more broadly, if you supervise people, you probably have a lot of other systems that you think people know how to use. But then again, if all you've done is say, here's a system, I want you to use it, they may not actually know how to use it in the way that you think that they do. So it may benefit you and or your company and or your trainees to actually step back and break it down and say, what are the pieces that people keep having issues with this system, and how can I teach it to them? And it doesn't have to be a major big study, but it could be that providing them with a model via a video, or you sitting down, or providing them with a chance to practice with a partner and ask one another questions and get feedback from you, the instructor, could end up making a huge difference in their effectiveness with this. And then even though you're spending more time up front, like making a plan, you may find that the efficiency with which you can actually train it after you've gone through all those steps is a lot better. So I would encourage people to take this as a model example of how you can use what we know to teach in areas that you're experiencing like day-to-day issues with, and sort of create a parallel system in that regard.
Excellent. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the episode. Folks know how to get in touch with Diana or Jackie if they have questions about the study. You just email us at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. Do you want to give your professional emails as well, or is that the easiest way? Nope, that works? Okay.
Sure. It's diana.perry-cruz@regiscollege.edu. Now you can kind of find me everywhere. But as I mentioned before, like this whole system that we developed here really doesn't operate outside of what we have set it up for inside Moodle, inside Regis. So I can't give everybody like all of the materials if that's what you were wishing for.
The concept you'll happy to talk about, but
course.
there's no, oh yeah, here's the PowerPoints, just grab these.
Yeah, it just doesn't operate that way. So,
sure.
Yeah.
Okay. But questions, you're more than happy to field. And Ryan, I know that you're busy with your own learning and job, so I don't know how much you want people to be bothering you, but is there a way folks could get in touch with you if they would like to hear more about this topic? Or?
I'm happy to be bothered. It's ryan.atkinson at Simmons, SIMMONS.edu. I don't have any other way to contact me. You could mail, snail mail, but that's it.
The one,
social
you
media.
want to give everyone your home address?
Yeah. 123 Fake Street.
I don't. I'm not going to do that
Any
this time.
city, town, state.
Anytown, USA. If they wanted supervision by mail, you'd be happy to do that.
I'd be happy. Like? Yeah, no,
okay.
Absolutely happy to do that.
Okay, good.
That would be amazing. Ryan, I just want to send you something. What's your address?
Trust me, it's cookies.
Thank you so much to Ryan Atkinson for joining us on the show tonight. It was a lot of fun to kind of get to see him and Jackie and Diana back together again, talking about their research. Not something we always get to do on the show quite this way. So it was a real treat for me as the host, and I hope it was fun for all of you to listen to. Thank you all so much for listening and supporting ABA Inside Track. There's a lot of ways you can do that. You can certainly subscribe to the show, maybe leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher. If you want more information about the show, you can find all these episodes posted on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature. You can go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to find links to all of the articles that we discussed for this episode, to find a place to purchase CEs for almost all of the episodes we've done, and to find an archive of all of our back topics. I'm sure there's something in there that you'd love to hear more about. And if you'd like even more ABA Inside Track content, why not join us on Patreon at patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where for just $5 a month, you can get all of our episodes ahead of time by a whole week, as well as access to voting for things like our long book club format podcasts and access to our live episodes, plus discounts in our CE store. If you want even more, like those aforementioned book clubs, join at the $10 or up level, and you can get 2 CEs per book club and no additional charge. Those are 2-hour podcasts all about a book related to behavior analysis. We do 4 of those per year. Our most recent one was our Supervision September episode, which actually did come out on the free feed. But if you wanted to get 2 Supervision CEs just for listening at no cost, well, you can join us and become our Patreon friend at patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. Some final thanks. Big thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!